everyone, and welcome back to Church Crime Time Tuesdays. I am your host, Lacey Bean, and today, wow, do I have a story for you. So if you have watched the video where I talk about my deconstruction journey, then you know that when I was in college, I was in a ministry that was more like a cult. After I got out of that, after a few years, I was able to identify that it was a cult. And after this, a kind of fascination grew in me to understand cults in general and how they get started and how people kind of get sucked in. I can understand how easy it is because, hello, been there, done that. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to cover some different cults on this channel. I am going to try my hardest every month to cover at least one cult. So when I decided to add a few to my list, the first one I decided I was going to cover was the cult called the Children of God. Now, if you know anything about this cult, then you're like, woo, you started with a big one. But I honestly knew nothing about the Children of God until I started doing my research. And I read a book on it, actually written by a lady who had grown up in the Children of God. And at the beginning, I was like, oh yeah, it's weird. Ew. Yeah, oh yeah. And then the further we got into it, I was like screaming at my book, like, no, this is not happening. So it's a doozy. I'm just going to put that out there for you in the beginning. So with that, let's lead into some trigger warnings. We are going to be talking about cults today. We're going to be talking about sexual assault, manipulation, rape, suicide, murder, religious trauma, spiritual abuse, and unfortunately, pedophilia. So if any of these topics are triggering to you, please skip this video and come back next week. It's most important for you to take care of yourself. I will see you in another video. So Children of God was a cult that was started in 1968 in Huntington Beach, California by a man named David Berg. Now, for you to truly understand how this cult got started, we have to dig into the history of who David Berg is. So I'm going to jump back and tell you a little bit more about his family and how he grew up. So David Berg was born in 1919 and he was actually a fourth generation evangelist. So he came from a long line of evangelical Christians. Now, this story really gets started with David's mother, Virginia. At one point, David's mother fell and broke her back in two different places. Now, she had had a few surgeries, but they were unsuccessful, and this left Virginia in a ton of pain. She was bedridden and every day suffering. Now, people at church would pray for her husband would pray for her, but nothing was happening. Until one day, when Virginia was laying in her bed, she remembered the verse that talks about how whatever you ask in God's name, that he will give it to you. And she sat there and prayed and begged God, and all of a sudden, she was miraculously healed. She rose from the bed completely out of pain, and her life was never the same after that. Now, because of this miraculous healing, this was something that Virginia had to add to her testimony, and this is how she started preaching about God to other people. Now, unfortunately, though, the belief of miraculous healings was not something that her congregation all agreed on or even held that belief within their denomination. And eventually this got them in some hot water, and eventually they were expelled from the Disciples of Christ. Now, Virginia and her family were not going to let this stop them, and they just decided to join the Christian and Missionary Alliance and become traveling evangelists. Now, because of Virginia's miraculous healing, it was easy for them to gather huge crowds and preach to numerous amounts of people and see many people's lives changed. Because she was able to gather such big crowds, one time during their travel evangelism years, they stopped in Miami, Florida, and the preacher of this church loved them so much, he asked Virginia if she would stay and be a full-time minister at their church. Virginia accepted, and that is where her family stayed for 15 years preaching and ministering down in Miami, Florida. Now, after 15 years, Virginia really missed the road and just doing travel evangelism, and so her and her family left and hit the road again. Now, out of all of their kids, their son, David, was the only one that really wanted to jump on the bandwagon of being an evangelist. And how he jumped in on this was he became his mother's driver for their traveling ministry. But unfortunately, in 1941, at the age of 22, David was drafted into the military for war. Now, since he was considered to be a minister or a preacher, he could get out of this draft. But he saw this as an opportunity to get out from under his mother's thumb and spread his wings and fly solo. So he joined the military and off he went. But unfortunately, while David was in the military, he actually got a double pneumonia infection. This infection was so bad that the doctors believed that he was not going to make it. And because Virginia had this miraculous healing, David sat in his bed dying from double pneumonia and asked the Lord that he would heal him. And he told the Lord, if you heal me, I will dedicate my whole entire life to you and your calling. And similar to Virginia's story, David said that in that moment he was miraculously healed and doctors were blown away that he was able to recover. Now, in my research, I couldn't find whether he had a heart condition due to the double infection of pneumonia or if he had a heart condition that developed from something else. But eventually he was medically discharged from the military because of a heart condition. After this, David rejoined his mom and started doing travel evangelism again. But it didn't take David long to become very annoyed that he was just kind of like his mother's driver, and he wanted a more prominent role in the ministry and to be a preacher. He said that he prayed about it and God told him that his time was coming and to just be patient. And so that's what David did. Now, while they were evangelizing in different states, David met a girl named Jane Miller. She was a devout Christian who grew up Baptist. They fell in love, and it didn't take them long to elope and get married in 1944. And it didn't take them long to start having kids. They had their first daughter in 1946, and then they had another son in 1948. 1948 was also the same year that David was ordained as a minister within the Christian Missionary Alliance. Now, David's first role was he was sent to a mixed congregation church. And this was a church that was having some problems with, getting along because it was such a mixed cultural church. There were mixed races. And it was, 1948-ish around this time. And people were not getting along because racism was sky high. Now, his problems at this church just got worse and worse because David was preaching inclusion and preaching things like giving your money to the poor and things like that. And the church was not liking it. They definitely liked their segregation. And eventually David was kicked out of the church. Now, because David got kicked out of the church, this became something that made David just really frustrated with organized religion, and he just went to doing his own kind of like travel evangelizing. Now, through his travel evangelizing, he actually ended up in Huntington Beach, California, where his parents had retired. He started taking odd-end jobs, and because he was in the military, he had access to what is called the GI Bill, and that allowed David to go back to school free of charge. So David was taking classes, and he was actually really pulling away from religion altogether. And he has stated that at this time, he was actually contemplating turning completely to communism. But that didn't happen, as we all can tell. He was really frustrated with his role, and in 1951, he said that he turned to God and just begged God for direction. Now, he said that the Lord told him that he needed to break away from the system and to take to the road to save souls for Christ, and so David just turned back around and went straight back to travel evangelizing. Now, David ended up attending a 3-month soul clinic in LA, but it was ran by a man named Reverend Fred Jordan. Now, Reverend Fred Jordan was very well known during this time. He was actually a TV evangelist, and this 3-month soul clinic was a place where people could go where they would train you to be a missionary. Now, David really felt at home when it came to any kind of ministry ran by Fred Jordan because they had a really big heart for feeding the homeless and going out to the streets and things like that. And that's where David really liked it. He didn't like being in a church congregation. Now, David ended up working for Fred for about 15 years, and he worked at different soul clinics. He actually worked at Fred's, it's called The Ranch out in Texas, which was another kind of training ground, but the ranch was very much more militaristic and demanding in its kind of training styles. And David worked there a couple of times as well. At one point, David and his family ended up moving to Miami and opening another soul clinic under Reverend Fred Jordan's ministry. Now, in Miami, when they opened this soul clinic, they would live communally and help train missionaries. And then on the summers, they would actually do travel evangelizing. Now, at the time, nobody knew this, but later on, we find out that during this time of travel evangelizing in the summers is when David started having a ton of affairs. Now, I'm not talking he would have an affair off and on or once in a while. I mean, any woman he could get his hands on, he was having an affair with. The nannies, even prostitutes, housekeepers. I mean, anyone and everyone David was cheating on his wife with. Now, because David was a minister, of course, this was not something that was known back then. Jane, if she did know, she just didn't give it any attention. Jane really was just wanting to serve the Lord, and so she kept her mouth quiet. Now, Jane felt that her time in ministry was ending, because at this point they had had 4 children, and so her job was to be a mom, and she felt her role within ministry was fading away. But then she realized that anytime David would preach, he would gather bigger and bigger crowds when the children were present. So this struck up an idea. Jane decided to get all of her kids together and create like a singing group, and they did. So all the kids would go with David when he would preach, and they would sing, and because they were little and cute, so many people were attracted to it, and so David's crowds just grew bigger and bigger, and his following just started to explode. They got a lot of attention for their kids. They would perform on the streets, and at times they were even performing on Reverend Fred Jordan's televangelist, channel. But David's preaching started to get very aggressive and fiery, and he was getting to the point of being like, forsake all, become Christian missionaries, and very kind of militaristic with his preaching, and this landed him in some hot. David would send his kids and anybody else who was, part of his following to local churches wherever they were going to, what he would say, blanket the area with flyers. These were like little leaflets that David would make and they would print out, and they would put them under every car, into everybody's hands. And they're doing this like at other churches. Like, they're not doing this just like on the streets or at grocery stores. They're literally going to other people's churches to preach God and to, steal their followers. It was weird. But this, of course, made the local pastors and leaders very frustrated, and they ended up calling the cops on David. And so David and his followers were like, oh, we got to get out of town. And so they skedaddled. At this point, David packs up all of his family in their motorhome, which was called the Ark. Yes, as in Noah's Ark. And they went back to the ranch in Texas, which was ran by Reverend Fred Jordan. Now, during his time on the ranch, Virginia, David's mom came twice to give David some urgent prophecies. If you don't know what a prophecy is, it's basically where somebody believes that they have heard a message from God and they need to either tell their congregation or give it to a specific person. Virginia shows up at the ranch and she says she has 2 urgent prophecies from God specifically for David. Now, the first prophecy was a warning of the coming Antichrist, and the end times prophecy was it was coming near. The second prophecy was that David would have the knowledge and the ability to understand and forecast the coming of Christ. She said that he would have the understanding and knowledge of Daniel in the Bible. Now, remember, Virginia lived back in Huntington Beach, California. David was in Texas with his family at the ranch. Virginia asked David to bring him and his family back to Huntington Beach, California, and minister to the hippies. This was in 1967, and so there were hippies everywhere. And Virginia spent her days making sandwiches and handing them out to all of the, homeless hippie crowd and preaching the word of God. And she needed help doing it because the crowd of hippies was just so big. She needed more hands to spread the love and message of Jesus. And so she asked her son David to come, and he did. Him and his whole family, except one of their daughters, Deborah, I think it was their oldest daughter, ended up staying in Texas at the ranch because she had actually already been married, and I think she had had a kid at this point. So she stayed there. David, his wife Jane, and all of their other kids went off, and they were now in Huntington Beach, California, preaching to the hippies. Now, it didn't take long for David to gather a big following. He had his kids performing by his side. They were offering free food. And so people were just kind of drawn to him. And this is when David said that he felt like he had found his flock because, God had told him that you need to break away from the system. And all of these hippies had kind of already done that. And so he kind of saw this as his opening. To fit in better, David decided to grow his hair out long and kind of, blend in with the hippies. He was seen as a very hip evangelist, and he was giving sermons about breaking away from the government and forsaking everything and talking about how the government was evil and the education system was evil and things like that. And because these hippies had kind of already broken away from the government, it was really easy for them to listen to David and take what he was saying very serious. Because they were breaking away from the system, they still wanted to have some mission and purpose in life, and David played on that, and they started to follow him in droves. I mean, these people were showing up with all of their belongings, their bank accounts completely wiped out, and just handing their money to David and become missionaries and be a part of whatever this cause was David was preaching about. Now, at first, what David was doing was seen as very positive in the media because a lot of these hippies were on drugs and alcohol. And David was saying that not only you had to forsake, like the government and this and that, you also had to forsake drugs and alcohol. And so he would say, you can't get high on drugs, you got to get high on Jesus Christ. So the media was seeing David as like a revolutionary because he was able to get people off drugs and alcohol. And so he was seen as very positive. And this, at the beginning, they were actually known as Youth for Christ. And this, I'm not even kidding, this is when youth ministry was literally born. Like, David's cult birthed youth ministry. Because he was getting all these people off drugs and alcohol and he was seen as very positive, churches from all over the nation were reaching out to David and asking him to come out and help them figure out a way to start their own youth ministry. And so David started sending his kids and other followers around the country to help start youth ministries. Now, this all kind of happened around 1968. This was also the year that Virginia, David's mom, ended up passing away. Now, this was kind of a green light for David to go even further with his ministries and with his messages because he didn't have the guidance or control of his parents. So he saw this as his way of starting a really big religious revolution. Now, like I said, churches were asking for David to come and help them, start youth ministries or, how are you preaching? How can we get the following that you're getting kind of thing. So David sent them all over. One of the places that he sent his older son was to Arizona. He sent his son and a woman named Esther. Now, they were in Tucson, Arizona, and they actually met a woman named Karen Zerby. She was a new recruit to the group, and they saw a lot of potential in her. And so David's son actually told Karen that she should go back to the Huntington Beach, California area to do some training at what they called the Light Club. And that's exactly what Karen did. And it didn't take long. It was only a couple months that she was there. And she actually became David's personal secretary and a little more. He actually started a secret affair with Karen. Not only that, he actually moved Jane into his home, the Ark, with him and his wife. Now you have this tiny little RV and you have Jane, Karen, and David living in there. And Jane is trying to say that, she saw it as normal. She was fine with it. It was okay. But now it came out later on, though, that Jane's sister, that she remembers Jane crying almost every night because she just didn't like it. And she would actually avoid going into the RV when she knew that Karen was present. Now, during this time, David decided to up his game and they started recruiting people from college campuses. And this is when they started to get into some hot water. Because they were recruiting people on college campuses, they actually got the police called on them numerous times. Around this time also, David was kind of amping up his message and becoming more and more radical with his teachings. And this was getting, picked up by the local news and media, and they were airing articles and news segments kind of pointing out the conflict and the danger within David's, radical teachings at this point. David also at this point wanted to send people all across America to be disciples. Now he wanted these to be married people, so he definitely put some pressure on people to get married, and he would actually team people up oh, you should marry her or you should marry him. And because they wanted to please David and to please God, that they saw this as their duty for Christ, and so they would get married. Now people started being fanned over all across America and even Canada. And at one point they had 120 different families fanned out across America, discipling and trying to gather new recruitments for David's new ministry, religion, cult, whatever you want to call it at this point. Now, at this time, they actually had a journalist call them the Children of God in an article, and they loved the name so much they adopted it, and that's what they were called after that. This same journalist also likened David to Moses, and David liked that comparison so much, he was like, I'm just going to change my name to Moses. And he did. So now he's being called Moses, and even later on, he shortens it to Mo. So he encouraged all of his other members and leaders to take on different biblical names. So forsake their legal name and take on a biblical name. And not long after that, it became a requirement. So every new recruit had to forsake their legal name and take on a new biblisical name. Jane, David's first wife, took on the name as Eve, and she was later known as Mother Eve. Karen, David's side chick, took on the name of Maria. Now, in the fall of 1969, they're escalating pretty quickly. And by the fall of 1969, they started doing what they called sackcloth demonstrations, where they would literally stand in front of like very big prominent like buildings or monuments or places within America. And they would have these sackcloth demonstrations. They would be dressed in sackcloth and they would have ash on their forehead, and they would be like preaching and proclaiming the end times and like for people to like turn. It was very much the whole like turn or burn, or like give everything to Christ and forsake your life kind of messaging. And this is when people really started to see them as like radicals and kind of weird. They had these demonstrations at like Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, like New York's like Times Square, and a few other places. Now, because people are starting to see them as weird and they're still doing travel evangelism, at one time in Louisiana, they got stopped and raided by the police. A few of the members, they were found to have warrants out for their arrest. Most of them, it was like drug charges from prior to them joining the Children of God. Those people were then arrested, and the group ran out of town. So they're starting to get a bad reputation, like in a lot of places within America. Now David just was like, this is persecution. And he was like, we need a safe place to go. So he upped him and his family and his followers, and they left and went to Houston. Now, if you remember, the ranch is in Texas, and David had the bright idea that this would be a great safe place for him and his followers. By this point, the ranch had stopped being used, and so he called up Reverend Fred Jordan, asked if this was a place that him and his followers could stay. Reverend Fred Jordan said, sure. You just need to take care of the property and fix it up. Since it hadn't been in use for a while, it needed a lot of work. In 1970, they all moved to the ranch, and this is where David started running things very similar to how Reverend Fred Jordan ran things, like very militaristic kind of style. They had a very strict schedule they needed to keep to. People had very strict jobs of cleaning and repairs, and then they'd have to go to Bible time and prayer time, and they had a whole bunch of stuff. And David at this point actually made it a requirement that all new recruits had to memorize 300 Bible verses within 3 months. Like, that's only 90 days. You are having to memorize more than 3 Bible verses a day. I couldn't do it. I'd be like, peace, I'm out. I failed out of the cult. Now they're still experiencing massive growth, and at this point they had basically doubled their numbers. Because he wanted to keep peace, because they did start getting some pretty nasty reviews within the media, being called a cult and saying that these people are being brainwashed, David allowed the members to write home. He was trying to keep the peace so that he didn't have like the police and stuff on his trail. Now, some of the members of the Children of God at this point even had family members arrive at the ranch begging and pleading with their family members to come home, trying to convince them that they were in a cult and that they were being brainwashed. But all of these people at this point are grown adults, and they can make their decisions for themselves. And ultimately, I don't think anybody left. They all stayed, and parents were devastated. They felt like they had lost their children at this point. Since their attention turned pretty nasty and they were getting called, a cult and things like that, David conveniently at this time got a message from God saying it was time to send people overseas. He basically said America's had its time. Like, it's had their chance. Like, let America burn. Let's go overseas and save souls over there. But because he was sending people overseas, and this was going to kind of not break up marriages, but like split spouses for, different lengths of time, David thought, I need to address the issue of sex. So one day he went to a hotel room, brought in all the top leaders of the group, and started talking about his new interpretation and belief of what is called the law of love. Basically saying that everything in the Old Testament was superseded by the commandments within the New Testament. And the 2 greatest commandments within the New Testament are to love God and to love your neighbor. So basically what David was saying is that everything was lawful under love, and that included sex outside of marriage. So basically this gave people who were married the option and the opportunity to have sex with other people outside of their marriage while still staying married and still staying good and pure in God's eyes. Now, this was definitely only allowed for the top leaders at this time. This did not trickle down to the followers for another handful of years. And people were like, sweet, have sex outside of marriage. It's good by God. Cool. I don't see anything weird about this. It's totally normal. Now, David said that this was a new revelation of the Bible for a new generation that was ready for some freedom. Basically, just David's way of trying to justify his weird interpretation of Bible verses. Now, when people were sent overseas, they would start what was called family homes. They would have different members stay with them and, things like that. But only married people could start these family homes. And so a lot of people were pressured to get married so that they could travel overseas and start a family home. Now, this was all under the disguise of religion. So if you're not making the dots, this is very spiritually abusive tactics that are being used to pressure people to get married. Oh, but God wants you to get married. Women were being approached by men saying, God told me that we are supposed to be married. If you grew up as a Christian and you were a teen, I want you to comment below how many times you had a boy come up to you and say, God told me you're supposed to be my wife. Because literally, I had that happen multiple times. If you didn't grow up in the evangelical church, then you probably didn't have that happen to you. But if you did grow up in the evangelical church, then please comment below and let me know I'm not alone, because I know I'm not. Now, I'm sure you've made the connection that David's new law of love was also just a way for David to, justify his affair with Miss Karen, aka Maria. And that is exactly what was done. That was exactly how people saw it, that it was justifiable now. And David even came out and said that God had told him that Karen was supposed to be his wife. And this introduced polygamy into the children of God. Now, I will say, I want to, sidetrack for just a moment. I have no problem with polygamy. If that is what you want to do, go for it. You do you, boo. I don't care. But when you are using religious beliefs and Bible verses and spiritually abusive tactics to say that, polygamy is the way to go and that this is justifiable under the Bible, that's when I have a problem with it, because that's very spiritually abusive and not okay. Now, David also was being investigated by a handful of different bureaus within America. And David was, of course, we've heard it all before, screaming persecution and saying that he needed to flee. Now, I'm going to look down because I want to get this right. David was being investigated by the New York Charity Fraud Bureau for fiscal chicanery, obstruction of justice, and mental and physical coercion of followers. But before David could, be charged with anything and face trial or any kind of justice, he ran to another country. Now, I'm not sure exactly what country David went to, because he decided, I'm going to go into hiding. Even his followers didn't know where he was, because he didn't want anyone to find him because he was being investigated. So even top leaders, his own family, didn't know where David was. So this meant David wasn't able to preach and do the things that he wanted to do and try to control his followers with new teachings and the new revelations. So David started a thing called the Mo letters. David would write down his teachings or prophecies or visions or dreams, and he'd put these in letters and send them out to his congregation. Now, in one of these earlier letters, David ended up writing one that said, "Flee to your mountain." And basically this was him saying, flee from America, get out of America, get to other countries, we're being persecuted, run. And a lot of people did. Pretty much all the followers left and went to different countries and started family homes. There were a few that stayed behind in America, but it was just a few. But that didn't stop the growth. In just a handful of years, they had family homes in literally every state of the United States. So it didn't stop them. But there was definitely way more followers and way more groups and family homes overseas. Now, by 1973, they had over 130 different colonies, over 2,500 different members, and they were across 50 different countries. But they did quickly realize that the whole doom and gloom of the end times was definitely not raking in the money that they needed. And so they started changing the way that they gathered donations by doing performances and singing, because they saw so much growth in that with the children who would sing beside David in the very early days, that they thought, let's put together singing groups. And they did. And a lot of these singing groups were actually pretty successful. They would rank top charts in different countries. I think they ranked in the top charts in France or Italy or something like that. It was crazy. They'd even perform on television and people loved them, and they would get donations not knowing how freaking weird they are. Now, during this time of growing, introducing polygamy and the new law of love, David ended up writing a Mo letter that was called Old Church, New Church. And he compared Jane and Karen as like the old church and new church. So he would compare Jane, his first wife, as the old church. He would say they were bitter, stuck in their ways, unwilling to change, and like not being receptive to new revelations of the Bible. But then he compared Karen to the new church, who was ready for new revelations and willing to stand by their leader. And this was kind of a slap in the face for Jane at this time. David even wrote in this letter that one night Jane had gotten so mad at David and said that like all you want is sex, and even stated that David was too carnal to be a man of God. And this made David so mad, he actually got up and slapped Karen in the face and said that he prayed and that God had told him that Karen was supposed to be his new wife, and she was going to stand by David and be an amazing leader of the cult. He even described Karen as, quote, the sexy new church. I am sorry, but that just sounds creepy in so many ways. Now, of course, as would anybody, Jane was very upset after this letter, and actually Jane left. She stayed in the group, but she left David and ended up marrying a different man. So now it is just David and Karen, aka Maria, and they're living life. David is not happy with how they're getting recruitments. Like, he wants to spice things up a bit. So David comes out with a new ministry called Flirty Fishing. Now, let me explain to you what this is. It's gross. Flirty fishing is when a woman would go into a bar or a restaurant or something and like hit on another guy and like flirt with him. And then she would bring the guy back home. She would sleep with him. And then after they slept together, she would introduce him to David so that David could preach to him and try to either A, get him on as a recruit, a new recruit for their group, or B, get donations from them. Now, he said that sex was a bodily need. And so by women going out there, flirting with these men and then bringing them back home and having sex with them, that they were fulfilling that bodily need, which opened these men up to being able to hear the message of God better. He said that sex was just a beautiful thing given by God, and that the devil had twisted it to make it seem dirty and gross, and that, this was just a normal thing, and that flirty fishing was just, it's nothing. It's not weird. But he also knew that like society was not going to be like, yeah, totally, that's so normal. You do you. No, the society would have been like, this is not good. This is spiritually abusive. This is manipulative. No. So what David decided to do to test out this ministry was that he fled and took Maria, aka Karen, to a new island, the Canary Islands, and a few other select women, and they tried this ministry out for like 3 or 4 years on the down low, not telling anybody about it. What? Now, this happened in 1974, and these women and David left and went to the Canary Islands, and it was expected that they go out flirty fishing. They also called it FFing. They had to go out FFing anywhere from 2 to 5 times a week. Like, this was expected of them. That is spiritually abusive, manipulative, and wrong, and so many other things. But these women wanted to please David. They wanted to please God, and they thought David was like the prophet. Like, he could hear and see from God. And so David telling them that this is what they needed to do, they felt like it was God telling them that this is what they needed to do, and they wanted to please God, and so they just did it. Now, in early 1974, Maria, I'm going to change her name to Maria, okay, because she's known as Maria from this point on, but this is Karen. This is David's woman he had an affair with and then took on as his second wife, okay? Karen is now Maria. So early in 1974, Maria ended up getting pregnant, but David was actually not the father. It was actually a man, I'm pretty sure his name was Carlos, don't quote me on that, but it was a man named Carlos who was a employee of a hotel that Maria had FF'd. Like, he was one of her catches, and she got pregnant by him, and she had a son named Davidito. That is his biblical name. I don't know where they got it, but he was known as Davidito. This was not uncommon for women to get pregnant by their catches. These kids were known as the babes of God. Like, they were born out of ministering and trying to like spread the love of God through FFing. So they were called the babes of God. Now, when Davidito was born, he was seen as the young prince. He was even called the young prince. And David came out saying that when he passed, that Maria and Davidito would be the leaders and that they would be able to see and hear and proclaim the message of God. You know, like, yeah. Now, by this point, David had written a lot of Mo letters. And so they decided that they were going to compile all of these Mo letters and create volumes. These volumes would be able to, help train new recruits. So they would be able to go back and read all of David's writings and read verses and do teachings and this and that. And so they put these together and wrote the Mo letter books. Davidito was born in 1974. It wasn't until 1976 that David Moses would write Mo letters that would teach about FFing and teach about what Maria and a few of the other women had been doing and how FFing was a great ministry thing. Now, the followers were pretty divided at this point. Some of them, a lot of them, were not comfortable with this because, these people were in loving, committed marriages. And now, because this was a very lucrative way of making money and getting followers, it became mandatory, basically. Like, if you did not do this, you were seen as like not being in line with Christ. And so you would get disciplined in some way, shape, or form. And so women would willingly go out and do FFing, whether they liked it or not, because they wanted to be in good standings, because they thought this was the will of God, because they saw David as their prophet. Now, when this went public, it didn't take long for the media to catch on and catch wind of this. And David got into some hot water. He had kind of come out of hiding to go to the Canary Islands. And so people knew where he was at. And the authorities wanted to arrest him for prostitution and being a pimp. But he got wind of this and off he ran again to go into hiding. Now, this time, David went into hiding. Nobody knew where he was at. And he stayed there literally forever. Even his grandchildren and his family stopped seeing David, and his grandchildren never saw him in real life and only learned and read about him through the Mo letters. Now, in 1978, David tried to do a rebranding and a reorganization of the Children of God. He ended up firing over 300 top leaders, many of which were his family. He said that the leaders were dragging their feet and not getting stuff done. And at the same time, he started to loosen the reins. People within the groups were not allowed to go out and get normal day jobs. They had to go out and either FF, or they had to go out, shake the can and get donations and things like that. Well, when David started to loosen the reins and do this whole rebranding thing, people were allowed to go out and just get a normal job. And because he had fired so many of the top leaders, they didn't have the oversight to ask or need to ask for permission. And so a lot of people did just go out and get a normal job because they found that way easier to make money to provide for them and their very large families, because of course they didn't believe in birth control, so they're popping out babies right and left. They went about this for a handful of years, and David was just teaching through his Mo letters. Oh, also, they had changed their name during this time to be called The Family. During this time of loosening the reins, people going out and getting normal jobs and things like that, David saw that this was not very lucrative. He realized that people would rather just go get a normal job and send in the required monthly fee, which was I think $10, than go out and do FFing. Now, these families that would just go out and get normal jobs and then send in their monthly fee, they were known as IRFers. Now, there was a mother of a family who was IRFers. So there was a mother and a father, and they had 3 children. Well, the mother actually got murdered, and another IRFer family sent a letter to David asking that he send money to the father, who is now a widow of, and has 3 children, that David would send money and help this family out. But instead, David was like, no, I am going to tear them to shit. David came out with a Mo letter blaming the family, saying that they didn't tithe what they were supposed to, and so God came and he collected what was his. And so basically saying God came down, murdered your wife, murdered this woman because she didn't tithe enough to the group. And he told people, like, if you do not go out there and do your FFing like God has called you to do, you're being disobedient to God, and he's going to come gather his money in any way, shape, or form that he sees fit. And, by August of 1980, IRF was banned within the group. And so that meant people had to come back, and a lot of women were back sent out doing FFing, basically being prostitutes for God, because that's what God wanted them to be. When David, banned the IRFers in 1980, he also started rebuking people publicly within his Mo letters. He would call people out for anything and everything, saying that they weren't being obedient to God or whatever it was. It was many, many leaders that he was rebuking in these letters. And these people could not stand up for themselves. They felt like they had to just sit there and take it because this was their life. They had no skills. They had no job. They had nothing to fall back on. And so if they left the group or got kicked out of the group, they could lose their family, they could lose their kids, and that they would be completely poor. And so these people felt stuck, and they have to just sit there being berated and, shamed and rebuked publicly in these Mo letters. Many of these people that were rebuked in these letters were forced to write public apologies that were then published again in subsequent Mo letters. They also were still getting really bad publicity during this time. Cult, prostitution, whatever you want to name it, they were probably getting claimed it. And this actually led the entire group to be banned from certain countries, including Hong Kong, Indonesia, and a few others. Okay, we're about to get into some deep stuff, so I'm going to give you another trigger warning right here. We're about to talk about pedophilia. I'm sorry, but you can't talk about this cult without talking about what is to come. So trigger warning again. I'm sorry. Now I'm going to read you a quote that was written in a Mo letter by David himself in 1980. It reads, quote, "The only way to get free of the devil and his lies and his prohibitions and guilt complexes about sex is to get rid of his lies and his lying propaganda, his anti-sex propaganda, and believe the Lord and his word and his creation and God's love and his freedom. That there is nothing in the world at all wrong with sex as long as it's practiced in love. Whatever it is or whoever it's with, no matter who or what age or what relative or what manner." God, I want to throw up. "And you don't hardly dare even say these words in private. If the law ever got a hold of this, they would try to string me up. They would probably lynch me before I got to the jail." Of course, you're talking about having sex with minors, you idiot. "When Paul said, 'All things are lawful unto me, but all things are not expedient,' he was as good as saying, 'I can indulge in any kind of sex I want to, but I've got to watch out for the system because it's against the law.' We are free in privacy, and that's about all. And we mightn't be free if they discovered what we do in private. There are no relationship restrictions or age limitations in this law of love. If you hate sex, you are one of the devil's crowd. If you think it's evil, then God and love are evil, for he created it. Come on, let's love and enjoy it like God does. He loves it." I want to go vomit. Ugh. Now, this was written in a Mo letter called "The Devil Hates Sex, but God Loves It." And as you can tell by reading that, David was basically giving any and all permission to have sex or do sexual activities or anything with anybody and with any age. Now, I'm sure anybody reading that or listening to that quote can know and see that David himself was for sure a pedophile, and he was using religion to disguise that and try to make pedophilia okay. He was disguising it with religion and with this new revelation, and he was seen as a prophet. And so people believed this. People got on board, whether it made them feel uncomfortable or not, because David was saying, "This is okay, this is great, this is good." It didn't take long for people to be like, "Okay, sure." In other Mo letters, David even would write about his dreams about having sex with prepubescent girls. And he even talked about one time how he wanted to have sex with his own mother. If that doesn't yell, this man is fucked up in the head, I don't know what is. Now, for David to try to teach his followers that sex is totally normal and it's something that should be introduced to children at a young age, and all of that was through his own son. Even though Davidito was not his biological son, he was raised by David and Maria, and they would send out different Mo letters on how they raised Davidito and what they did. And I'm telling you now, it is disturbing by all means. Eventually, they took all of these Mo letters about the life of Davidito and they compiled it into a volume itself. Now, in these letters, I'm going to kind of just run through a little bit of it. I'm not going to go into like all of it because there's just too much, but forewarning if you go look into them. But David said that when he was growing up, he had a nanny that when the nanny would put him to sleep, that she would pleasure him orally to get him to go to sleep. And when I mean like little boy, I mean saying like 2 years old. Now, when David's mother found out about this, she put a stop to it, of course, like anyone would. But he basically said like, oh, his mother, Virginia, like she just didn't know about the new revelation of the Bible. David would say that love is free and should be proclaimed by children. And so he literally like goes through these letters and explains in detail like how they would raise Davidito. Like they would do what David's nanny did to him. They would do that to Davidito. And Davidito, of course, liked it. Like it's a stimulation. It's a feeling that, of course, feels good. It's supposed to. It's just not meant for children. And so he would, try to get people to like put their hands down there. And I mean, it was just gross. Like just fucking gross. They encouraged their families, their members to do this with their children and to like introduce sexual stuff to their children at a really, really young age to like make it normal because sex is good. And guys, I know I've done that a lot where I'm just like grossed out, but like it's fucking gross. Ugh. They would even encourage like the kids to like do sexual things with each other as kids. And it was seen as just like sex stuff was seen as just very normal. The women even at one point would make videos of them dancing, doing like strip teases and like lap dance type things on video to send to David. And it wasn't just the women. They would get their children, like they're freaking toddlers in this video wearing like a shawl thing that's like sheer and dancing provocatively. And David would get these videos and watch them. They were like for him, like why? There was so much more that happened when it comes to sex and minors and stuff, and I'm just gonna end that there and just move on because yeah. Ugh. Okay, so by the mid-1980s, they started having what was called victory camps. And this was because, they'd been around for a little while and they were starting to get kids who were born within the ministry that were teenagers now. And a lot of these teenagers were rebelling. And so they started making victor camps where people could go when they were rebelling against the ministry. At first, this was a place where kids who were like really rebelling, doing really, really, really bad things, like not even really bad things, but just like bad things in the eyes of the cult. Basically, like if they were questioning their beliefs or lying or stealing or like bigger kind of things that normal parents wouldn't bat an eye of, whatever, but they saw them as really bad. And so they'd have to go to these victor camps and they were forced to do physical labor. Sometimes they were tied to beds. They were forced to memorize a bunch of different like Mo letters and Bible verses and do a whole bunch of studying. They would be locked in their rooms at night. They would be put on what's called silence restriction, and they literally like weren't allowed to talk to anybody. And sometimes this would last weeks or even like a month, or it very rarely I think lasted just a day or two. It was always like really long. They would even be subjected to public beatings. Like this was just these victor camps were awful, and kids were eventually going there for just anything and everything. If you had a bad attitude, gone. If you were seen as like being negative, because like negativity is the devil, like you have to stay positive and be happy all the time, boom, you were sent. Like it's just so abusive. Now, as you can tell, as I'm describing the Victor camps, you probably guessed that corporal punishment was definitely supported within this ministry. It's the 80s. You know, corporal punishment was very just normal back then. But their corporal punishment, for some of these people, it was pretty extreme. Now, a lot of this information that I got is from a book called Sex Cult Nun, and it's by Faith Jones. She's actually a grandchild of David Berg. So she wrote in her book recounting a story of one of her sisters who ended up stealing some money from her parents and then went down the street and bought some candy. And they found out about it. They ended up finding the wrappers in her room. They asked her about it and she lied. And then she eventually confessed to it and everything. They weren't allowed to eat sugar. So she had stolen, ate sugar, lied, was disobedient, and then lied about lying. I think were the 5 things. And the way that these children were punished for things like that was that they got 20 swats, like a spanking, but they got 20 hits. And because she had 5 demerits against her, basically, she got 20 for each one. And he lined up all of the other siblings, and they were all forced to sit there and watch her be spanked 100 times. And these weren't just like spots. They were huge hits. And her describing this situation and what she remembers of it is devastating. I was crying by the end of it because I'm like, no. Later in the 1980s, the AIDS epidemic started, and that is when they decided in 1987 to ban FFing. Now, they didn't do this out of the goodness of their heart. They did this out of fear of catching, all of the sexually transmitted diseases or AIDS. The only people that women could have sex with that were outside of the children of God or the family at this point were basically catches, so fish they had caught that were not in the ministry, that were not considered the family, but they had caught them prior to banning FFing. They were basically grandfathered in. By the 1990s, there had been a lot of accusations against the family for child abuse. This prompted many investigations into the group, but every investigation showed up that there was no abuse happening. But later on, when people left and started speaking up about these times, they were able to, be taught how to avoid these interrogations and make it look as if there was no abuse of anything happening. They had investigated, 750 children and came back showing no abuse at all. And this is how much these people were freaking brainwashed into believing that the government was out to get them and what they were doing was so godly. Now, as time went on, they started having what they called second generation members. These were members that were born within the children of God and had grown up their entire life. They had decided that they would put out a survey and just kind of see how has life been in the ministry for your entire life. And they found from these surveys that a lot of, especially girls, experienced what they called trauma from different sexual encounters. So they decided at this point to start making some restrictions and changing who could, have sexual encounters with who and at what ages. They started saying that you couldn't have sex until you were a teen, and then when you could have sex, you could only have sex with other teens, but then by the time you were 21, you were free game to any of the older men within the group. So if you were past 21 years old and another married man in the group wanted to come and have sex with you, they would call that sharing. You're supposed to share with me. I want to show you God's love by having sex. And even if the women didn't want to share, it wasn't a rule that you had to share. But if you didn't share, then the group would see you as not being fully devoted to God. And then you would get in trouble for not being fully devoted to God. So it was their way of going around it. You weren't in trouble for not having sex with this man or sharing with this man. You were in trouble for not being completely 100% devoted to God. In October of 1994, David Berg actually passed away, and the family was now run by Mama Maria. Mama Maria started coming out with what they called the mama letters. A lot of people, within the group started to see a shift and changes because Mama Maria's letters weren't as like spunky and outgoing as David's letters. But a lot of them still stayed because they felt like this was, God's calling, and this is where they had to be. Like, this was the right thing to do. Mama Maria ended up making some changes over the years. She ended up like increasing the tithing to like 14%. And she even made some changes to their sexual beliefs. These are weird. Again, she called these the loving Jesus revelation. And first she said that when you had sex, you had to like picture that you were having sex with God. Yeah, that's weird. She even said that you were called on to masturbate to Jesus. And if you're a man, then you're supposed to visualize yourself as a woman when you masturbate to Jesus. I should not be smiling and laughing at this, but guys, this is just weird. And it doesn't stop there. She even said that her third point was that she encouraged all her members that they were supposed to say sexy things and talk dirty to Jesus while they had sex. I just don't even have words at this point. Now, I'm sure you've all guessed it that a lot of these people, especially the second generation members, have experienced a ton of trauma being in this group. And by 2003, a large portion of the second generation members had left, and they started opening up about the trauma that they experienced within this group. A lot of them, there was a lot of members that had left in the 90s and started opening up, and even more in the early 2000s. Now the family just came back with, they're possessed by the demons. Like, the world has gotten a hold of them. That's lies. They would deny everything. Now, even Davidito himself had left in 2000. He had actually gotten married to a girl that was actually a part of the family too, and they had left together. Now, they had gotten married, but by 2004, I think it was 2004, they ended up splitting. They're both working through some major trauma. Davidito was very, very upset. Actually, his real name is Rick, so I'm going to call him Rick from now on, okay? Rick was very upset with how he was abused as a child and how many other members were abused. And he was mad. He wanted justice in any way, shape, and form. Now, in 2004, Rick had heard that his mom had visited Tucson, Arizona at Christmas. And so in order to try to catch her in one of her visits, he decided to move to Tucson, Arizona himself. Now, in January of 2005, Rick sent a letter to his mom asking that she would come and have like dinner with him. She actually, instead of going, she sent her nanny, like a nanny that was from the house. And this nanny was actually one that hadn't grown up like with Rick. This was a completely different nanny. And so, but he still took the opportunity and he went to have dinner with them. Now, after the dinner, somehow Rick convinced the nanny to go back to his apartment with him. She went to the apartment with him, and Rick ended up actually stabbing the nanny to death. And then he drove out to a desert where he took his own life. Now, the reason that we know why all of this happened was Rick actually made a video the night, I think it was like the night before this all happened. He made basically like a confession tape, like a suicide tape, where he talked about like the abuse that he had gone through and why he wanted revenge and justice, and that everybody in this group needed to be held accountable for what they did. And his way of doing that was by murdering them. The main target that we can assume was he was trying to murder his mom and a few other of the top leaders, but he kind of just like took whoever he could get, and that was this nanny. And then he took his own life. I'll link the video down below. He rambles a lot. You can tell that he doesn't have like all of his thoughts put together. But you can definitely see that he's traumatized and that he went through a lot of shit. Now, of course, because of this murder-suicide, the group got a lot more attention in the media, and a lot of the accusations of abuse resurfaced, and there was just a lot of talk. But the group came back saying that the reason Rick did what he did was because of outside influence, and they blamed it on basically him leaving the family. Like, this wouldn't have happened if he would have stayed with the family, and just, gaslighting again. Now, I wish that I could come and say, like some big thing happened and they disbanded and the group is no more, but they actually, like, they are still running. They still have family homes all over in different countries, and even here in the US, like, they still are active, as scary as that is. They claim that they have made a lot of changes when it comes to their law of love, and that, you know, they even deny that, like, sex with minors or sexual activity or things like that, any kind of pedophilia, was just, like, it was not a thing. Like, people lied about that. Like, we have the writings, like, we see the Mo letters, like, it's fucking wild. There are many people who have left this cult and written their stories and talked about it. You can just do a Google search and hear many people's stories. I do highly recommend the book Sucks Cult Nun by Faith Jones. You can listen to it on Audible. Here, once again, another video recommending Audible. Audible, come on. But it's a great book. It's a long read, but it goes through the beginning. It tells, like, the history of the Children of God, and then it kind of gets into her personal story and her journey being a member. And she's the granddaughter of David Berg. So it's definitely an interesting read. Highly recommend it. But yeah, that is the case of the Children of God. That's all I've got for you today. I hope that you found this episode disgusting and repulsive, because I definitely felt that in my research. So yeah, if you found that interesting, hit the subscribe button, ring that bell so that you don't miss any of the uploads, and hey, give a thumbs up for this video, and I hope you guys have a great week. Remember, take care of yourself, drink some water, do some self-care activities, go take a walk. Everyone probably needs to go, like, grab a couple Oreos and watch a Netflix, like, I don't know, like, baking show, just to unwind after listening to this horrific cult. But remember, as always, don't be a twat waffle. Have a great week, and I will see you next Tuesday. Just kidding. No, I won't. I won't see you next Tuesday. Next week is my week off. I will see you the week after. And yeah, that's it. I'm going to shut up. Okay, bye!